So today, basically, I guess I want to give you some snapshots, really. I think we all, or many of us, and I certainly share this, have in my head, I guess, ideas about a kind of history, about where we've come from in terms of supporting people with learning disabilities, that might give us some clues about where we're going. And really, I want to kind of take you through some, because I'm no historian, some kind of snapshots of that history, which I think might kind of shake our views, I guess, of kind of easy kind of stories or narratives that we tell ourselves about the history and where we're going. And then talk about some things that have stayed the same, continuity, and some things that have changed over time in terms of who counts as a person with learning disabilities within kind of the official world of services, a bit about work, a bit about health, a bit about rights, and a bit about inclusion. Then finish off with some reasons to be fearful, and for Ian Jory fans, reasons to be cheerful. So some snapshots. I guess quite often when we hear talk about kind of the history of people with learning disabilities and support for people, it always starts at kind of big, bad Victorian institutions. Actually, of course, there are hundreds and thousands of years before that. And I guess particularly, I think, with the era that we're entering into now, whether we want to call it austerity or whether we want to call it something different, I think this time before the institutions is actually really important for us to understand. So before kind of Victorian times, we'll come to that in a minute, what that involved. We're talking about a mainly sort of pre-industrial economy and society. So there weren't big industries, there weren't big factories, there weren't big cities. Most people didn't live in big towns and cities at all. And in terms of support for people locally, what there mainly were the poor laws. So the poor laws were decided on by very local councils, parish councils. They decided how much they were going to support people locally, and they were there to provide really the basics. So if you were really struggling, kind of falling through the net, you might get some kind of poor law support. And the label, I mean, one of the issues with talking about history is the horrendous labels that have been applied to people over time. So in this talk, I don't really want to talk about those labels and what they are because they're really awful and horrible. But and those labels have changed, people have changed. But the label that would now relate to a person with learning disability wasn't applied routinely to people. So it was only applied to people if they needed financial support, so there might be some kind of family crisis and their parents weren't there anymore, or if their behaviour was really, really an issue for kind of people living around them. So most people with the label of learning disability who would have that label now wouldn't get any form of support at all. But that's because actually they were doing fine, thank you very much. There was no need, or the argument was that there was no real need for support. People were finding a way to be productive, contributing, involved, part of the places where people lived. Whether you frame that as natural support or whether you frame that as neglect, I think is an interesting question. But the kinds of support that the poor laws could provide for people are interesting when we think about where we are now, I guess. A workhouse was one option, but also there were options like financial support for family members. Keepers or nurses, as they were called then, who would give lodgings or care to people. Is that like a shared lives approach now in some ways? And also financial support for the person to live independently. So even before this whole panoply of, this whole range of, we've got big services and we're trying to find complicated ways of supporting people. I think, as Hazel said, it's even less new than we think it is, actually. And we're talking about ways of supporting people that were around many hundreds of years ago. Another snapshot, the Industrial Revolution. First, there was a phase of, I guess, the rapid kind of invention of industry, really, I suppose. So there were suddenly kind of big factories, big works, bigger engineering works, and that meant a massive change in the way that people lived. So people were moving from countryside to towns and cities. The kind of workforce that was needed to do this kind of stuff needed to be educated in some sort of way. So you need at least to be able to sort of tell the time, so you know when to turn up to work, or you might need skills in kind of reading, numbers, those kinds of things. So suddenly the kind of needs of society for the kind of people who could contribute in a way that made money, which became more important, was changing. And when you're packed into a city, when you're packed into a town, very, very crowded, the tolerance for people behaving in ways that are different really changed. So it's much easier, it became much easier to stand out. You know, if I walk from here to New Street and I simply smile at every person I see on the street, it's very soon they will mark me out as being a bit odd. It doesn't, and I never smile at anybody, it's never. But it really doesn't take much for you to be odd, for you to stand out as, oh, that's unusual, that person's a bit different, in the world we live in now, whereas maybe that wasn't such an issue before. And I think for people with learning disabilities, it made it harder for people to contribute in an economic way. So contribution now became about having a job, earning a wage, and that became more difficult. And families in those situations, most families needed everybody to contribute. It's much harder to have somebody with you as part of your family if they weren't generating money. And as I mentioned, it's much easier to stand out and be obtrusive, in Irving Goffman's words. So then we saw the rise of institutions, and again, I guess everybody kind of knows this story, but the first wave of them were, in effect, residential special schools run by the voluntary sector. That's how we would phrase them now. So the idea was you take the most educable, apologies for that word, people, only a small proportion of children. The idea was that they would be there for 5 years, they would learn useful skills, and then they'd be off. You know, that sounds similar to probably some prospectuses and brochures that we see today. But they were designed for people to be there for a limited time, and they were relatively small, I think, as well. But on the back of that, then the kind of the nature of what an institution was started to change. So there's some very kind of early spectacular successes advertised by those places, but that wasn't kind of borne out. Again, this issue all the time of scaling up. You know, we have something small and it's great, and people are committed, and it works really well. Once you try and make that routine or try and make it massive, it all kind of falls apart a bit, or it doesn't kind of work as well as those kind of original small committed places did. I think that's a big lesson for us across history. We've always thought about how do we scale up. Actually, maybe it's how do we increase the number of small-scale things we have that work really well? How do we make that? How do we kind of motivate people to stay small, but have more small rather than having big? So the second wave of institutions were state-run, usually by counties, local authorities. So at this point, it's worth remembering that institutions only became hospitals in 1948 with the invention of the NHS. So before then, people weren't patients. People weren't identified as having a health problem. So, and then suddenly in 1948, they became patients, which I think has long-term consequences for people. So they're state-run, not selective. They were bigger. They had to be cheaper. So you know, the cost per person of an institution was incredibly low. By 1881, the estimate that there are about 30,000 people with a label that would now be learning disabilities living in institutions. But all through this era of supposed institutions, it's always worth remembering that this time about the same number were living outside institutions. So again, we have this idea of kind of, there was this great wave of institutions, and we had to get people out. But there were always large numbers of people who never went to an institution. My next snapshot I've called Eugenics on the Cheap, and although we're living in an era of social services cuts for the most part, I think this is one time where we should be grateful that local authorities weren't properly funded to implement national policy. So there are increasing numbers of people with learning disabilities who got this label that would now be learning disabilities, but then was not. And there's a change, I guess, in who fell into that group. And increasingly, there's a view of people as a kind of social threat. So increasingly, those labels got to be applied to kind of men who are petty criminals, women who were supposedly loose in their morals at the time. But so this group of people then became a slightly different group of people who were then a kind of social threat. They were a threat to well-functioning societies. And the national policy aim in 1913, which isn't really that long ago, it's only 100 years ago, was eugenics. So being basically, we need to stop these people having children. And that meant we need to permanently segregate people away from everyone else in the classic kind of institution, the way that we think about permanently. So it's not about, you come in for a placement, you learn some stuff that's useful, you then go out again. It's actually people need to be there for the whole of their lives. And the rhetoric then was about protecting society from people with learning disabilities, but also there was an undercurrent about protecting people from the societies in which they were living. So the plan was to do this through local authorities and councils, but central government didn't attach enough cash to it, perhaps fortunately. So there was an expansion in institutions, but also, again, we saw lots of people who didn't go into institutions, who were supported under supervision or guardianship orders, sometimes with their own families outside institutions. So again, alongside this era of the big institution, there's also this kind of undercurrent of support for people to continue living with families, communities. And also the opening of the occupation centres, which eventually would mutate into adult training centres, which eventually would mutate into social education centres, which would eventually mutate into day centres, and now is slowly kind of drifting away. So our next snapshot, moving on after World War II, where we saw some massive changes, and I think we started to see, if you like, kind of the skeleton of our current framework of services come into place. So first of all, there was the Education Act in 1944, and that brought in special education for some children with learning disabilities, but not everyone. There were some children who were only deemed to be educable in the 1970 Act, which again isn't very far away at all. The NHS was only created in 1948. So again, as I mentioned, these institutions which are local authority run were now hospitals, so people therefore had a health issue. And eugenics was discredited, and human rights, I put invented slightly tongue-in-cheek, but human rights became a kind of a thing, an existing thing. The peak of institutions only occurred in the 1950s and the 1960s, which is again worth bearing in mind in terms of how recently this was. Possibly around 60 to 64,000 people at the time. But again, even then at this peak, there were still around 35 to 40,000 people living outside institutions under care or guardianship orders. So again, there's always been people who are outside institutions. Then we move on to the kind of community care era. So throughout the 60s and into the 70s, lots of scandals in institutions and exposés of how barren institutional life was for people with learning disabilities. And it's interesting when you see kind of Winterbourne and other places too, actually, how similar, if you read the reports about what went wrong, how similar the features are actually over time, over 40 years. That the things that happen and why they happen are very similar over that time. In 1970, we had social services departments invented. So again, we think of social services as always being there in municipal buildings, but actually they're quite new. They're under 50 years old. The white paper Better Services came in 1971, and that was a real sea change. That was that talked about drastically reducing, although not completely eliminating institutions for people, and also talked about a big expansion of supporting people in community settings. And through the 1980s, we saw a big reduction in hospital places. And this kind of wave of campuses on hospital grounds, through to hostels, which are quite big, kind of 20 people, through to residential care, through to supported living. And then now potentially onto kind of shared lives, although that might be new or old, people owning their own homes, people being tenants, those kinds of issues. And we also saw an increase in community services. Again, these were things that had kind of always been around in some form, but were certainly massively expanded and changed. So day centres, more support to families. But I think the real question, the aim and the motivation of this community care era was ordinary lives. That was the mantra, So people with learning disabilities can have an ordinary life just like anyone else has. Same houses, same streets, jobs, everything. But I think there's a question mark around whether that series of changes really resulted in ordinary lives for most people with learning disabilities. The blue line there, this is from 1969 and then 1994 and then through kind of throughout the recent decade. NHS inpatient services, as you can see, dropped massively from 1969 to 94, and then it's become smaller now. Over that time, the green line is day centres. You can see massive expansion from 1969 to 1994, but it's dropping off over time from 2005. And the same, interestingly, for people in residential care homes, the red line. Again, a big expansion from 1969 to 1994, but a gradual slight reduction since then. So reduction in residential care isn't a new thing. It's actually been steadily happening from quite an early peak. Where are we now? As I said, there are real issues, I think, about whether ordinary lives was really produced or created for people under community care. And now with government changes, with austerity, I think there's a question of whether we're seeing a kind of withdrawal of the welfare state from people, whether people see that as withdrawal, of taking away things that people need and want, or whether it's framed as liberation from the welfare state. And I think there are currents which you could interpret in both ways at the same time, in fact. So there's a real issue about, as I mentioned, these kind of new services, the kind of day centres, residential care. Are they actually too restrictive? Are they still separating people from everyone else? The policy aims that came in valuing people and valuing people now in the 1990s, the policy aims of self-determination, independence, rights, choice. Do our services really reach that end for people? Is that how people with learning disabilities experience their lives? We're seeing gradual shifts, as I've said, away from residential care and day centres, but what are they being replaced by, if replacement is your goal? And finally, we've seen the arrival of personal budgets, which again was held as having very radical potential, but I think as all policy aims that have that radical potential, whether they're realised in reality for people, is a different question. So I've got loads of numbers, but I'll just whiz through them very quickly. This just shows the number of adults with learning disabilities in residential nursing care. Over pretty much 10 years, it's gradually gone down over time. But we've seen more adults who are living with their families. So this is the number of adults with learning disabilities who are known to councils, who councils recognise and say, yes, this is an adult with learning disabilities, we know who they are. Apparently more people living with families, and we are seeing gradual increases in supported living tenancies, shared lives. As we've seen, the blue line at the top is the number of people who are using day services funded by councils, a gradual drop over time. The big drop, which is the light blue line, is the number of people, the number of adults with learning difficulties who are getting support from a professional of one kind or another. Massive drop by about half in a very short period of time. We're seeing increases in the number of people getting home care, increases in other services, increases in adaptations as well. We're also seeing apparently a massive shift in the people who get self-directed support. So adults with learning disabilities getting self-directed support. The problem is that the blue bar at the bottom, that's where the increase is. That massive increase is in council-managed personal budgets. So this is a personal budget where the council actually manages it for you. How nice of them. And that means that actually, because with In Control, we've been doing surveys of people who are getting personal budgets for a number of years now. And many people who are getting council-managed personal budgets will say things like, do I have a personal budget? What's one of those then? Is it my talking book service? And people report things like, yes, I have a personal budget. My council gives me a list of 2 council services that I can choose from. So I think it's fair to say that there are questions about how meaningful this radical shift towards personal budgets is for some people. For some people, it's great. For some people, I'm not sure they see a difference, really. And as Hazel's talked about, I think it's fair to say that as yet there is little change in the number of people in inpatient units. We talk about social services cuts a lot. The interesting thing about social services spending is that for people with learning disabilities, up until 2013-14 at least, it's actually increased. and it's still been increasing in relation to inflation too. So there have been massive cuts to older people's services, for example, but as yet there haven't been massive social services cuts to services for adults with learning disabilities. But this level of spending isn't keeping pace with the increasing number of adults with learning disabilities who need services. So although it's been relatively protected, it still isn't enough to keep pace with need and demand. And one worry that I have is that obviously people in social services, local authorities who are trying to manage their budgets see this too. If you're looking for somewhere to cut, someone you might say, well, they've still had things pretty good when other people have suffered. They might think actually services for people with learning disabilities might be a place to have a look at. And the same across the board. So continuity and change. I've been at lots of events over many years where people have a grand narrative, a grand story about history and what it means. One of them is kind of things can only get better, to coin a phrase. So we hear institutions were bad, and then we have paradigm. I heard this from people in the States. So, yeah, it's great. We got paradigm shifts, man. And they're talking about there was institutions. Then we got this paradigm shift to community care. Then we got this paradigm shift to self-determination. It's great. Yes, for some people, but it's not the whole story. There's kind of a time before institutions, and that's not how it appears to everyone at all. Another one is it's all going to hell in handbaskets. So everything's getting worse. It was brilliant pick a time. It was all really great then. People were properly supported, and now it's all just getting worse and rubbish. Again, I think that simplifies the experience for people too. And there's one that it's always been rubbish. So the idea that we had institutions and what's replaced institutions in terms of support is just as bad. It's still institutional, really. And for some people, that is absolutely true, but for other people, it isn't. And there are some people who weren't in institutions in the first place either. So I just want to whiz through a few issues. One about who counts, one about where people live, work, health, rights, and inclusion. One thing that history shows us is that who counts as a person with learning disability officially shifts massively over time. So if you look before the rise of institutions, there weren't many people who would get that label and come to the attention of any kind of support. In institutions, the numbers of people increased massively. Maybe people were kind of created by the fact of the societies, the people they were in, and it started to get this kind of threat kind of thing on top. And now it's changing again, maybe. So we know that people who, say, 20 years ago would have got a label of mild, moderate learning difficulties, that they're starting to no longer be identified within education and social services systems, I've got some numbers in a minute. Despite the fact that we know that people with learning disabilities, good news, are surviving. More people are surviving, particularly more people with complex health needs, and they're surviving through into adulthood and into old age. That's great news. But we need support for those people. I also wonder if there's a shift towards a greater emphasis, and again, I haven't got really data on this at all, but on this sort of notion of protection for vulnerable people with learning disabilities. So there's an increasing kind of framing of people with learning disabilities as a group, as a vulnerable group who need protecting. And what protection means in those terms is actually putting people somewhere segregated out of the way where they will not interact or engage with the world very much at all. And what happens to the huge numbers of people who no longer have the label of mild and moderate learning difficulty? Given this era that we're going into, actually, is it a kind of a new poor law era for that very large group of people? So just to illustrate this is from some projections that we did a few years ago, trying to project on the basis of kind of improving healthcare, improving survival of people, how many people over time would need social care. So the red line is kind of in the middle. You can see there's a massive increase projected just to 2023, which isn't that far away. If you take the red line, you're talking about an increase of about 80,000 people in the number of adults with learning disabilities who would need social care on pretty tight criteria. So we're not kind of, offering services for all under that scenario. So we're talking about a big increase in the number of adults with learning disabilities who will need support. what do we see? Well, this is the number of children with learning disabilities who have statements, special educational needs statements. Microphones here. The middle block is children who have severe learning difficulties. The right-hand block is people with profound and multiple learning difficulties, according to the way they're labelled in education. As you can see, the numbers of children in those two groups are going up. The number of children on school rolls is going up, so it's not a surprise. The thing that concerns me is the group on the left. These are children with moderate learning difficulties, where just over 5 years, from 2010 to 2015, we've seen a drop of about a quarter in the number of children who have a statement of moderate learning difficulties in education. Where are those children going? What's happening to them? How they're being supported? There's also the well-known phenomenon of the transition cliff. There's a little dotted line on the left at the top. So this is across the age range of people with learning difficulties. At the top, we can see the proportion of children with moderate learning difficulties. The line at the bottom is the number of children with severe profound learning difficulties. And the solid line there is the number of adults known to GPs. Basically, the number of people who we know about in adult services, whether that's GPs who know more people than social services do, is pretty low. And it's about the level of the number of children with severe and profound learning difficulties. So there's this massive bunch of children with moderate learning difficulties who just vanish in adult services. Adult services no longer recognise them as such. What's happening to that group of people? Where people live, we know from history that large numbers of people with learning disabilities have always lived outside residential services and institutions. So I guess there's a question, were the kind of the big institutions a blip in history? Rather than seeing them as kind of the place where everything starts, were they in some ways actually a blip that squeeze the kind of creative options which we had before and maybe now we're returning to, such as shared lives? We're seeing an increasing reliance on people continuing to live with their families well into adulthood. So ideas that people with learning disabilities would have the kind of usual life course that most of us have. You're at school, you become a teenager, you get really grumpy with your family. Got a daughter who's 11, so we're just on the cusp. And then at some point, you don't want to live with your family anymore. You want to go and live on your own, or with friends, or with some other place. The policy now relies on that not happening for probably, for a very large number of people with learning disabilities. Because if that happened, the system couldn't cope. So it relies on people staying with their families well into adulthood and sometimes old age. And as I mentioned before, I get the sense of a kind of an increasing emphasis on safety and protection, but again, done on the cheap, as we had in the kind of the institutional era, but in a different form. Even supported living services, for example. This pyramid here, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And whatever you think about it as a theory, I guess, the idea is that you need to get the stuff done at the bottom before you can reach the top. Looking at those lists there and those bands, where do you think services are pitching for in their support for people? I think increasingly they're pitching it at the bottom. And you see in some places, less ambition to pitch for the top, or even anywhere near the top. So I kind of worry about what the ambition of services is and what's that saying about people's lives. On to work, and I think the NHS England as employers and getting the NHS to employ people is a fantastic move, actually. It's great to see that from NHS England, and I wish other kind of big agencies, I wish social services councils would actually be as in the forefront as NHS England are with that. But we've seen very low employment rates across, throughout time. And yet the ironic thing is that even though people with learning disabilities weren't thought to be capable of kind of paid work in the open market, but actually we require on the work, we have required the work of people with learning disabilities that's unpaid. So in the institutions, the way that institutions work, the economy of them means that they needed unpaid work from the people that were living there. Without all the work that people with learning disabilities did, who were inmates at the time in those institutions, they wouldn't function. So people were thought to be able to work in that setting, but not in open employment. And now there are people who pay to do therapeutic work placements. So you're working in your cafe, you don't get paid a wage for it, you pay the person who's providing that cafe because it's therapy or it's work experience or it's placement or it's training. You know, you're capable of work, but you're not capable of being paid. I think that's an interesting issue. And we need to think about what the labour market is within which people with learning disabilities are competing now. You know, we're seeing change. We're seeing much more kind of 0 hours, part-time contracts. We're seeing, you know, many more kind of young people aiming for that kind of work where they might have aimed differently. And we might need to broaden our conception of what work is. We need to recognise and promote, I think, the contributions that people with learning disabilities can and do make within and outside of paid employment. Right. So in 1991, we know that about 5% of people in residential services were working. 2013-14, that had improved massively to 6.7% in any form of paid self-employment. Most of that very part-time. I think there's been changes over time about how the poorer health of people with learning disabilities has been framed, from kind of inevitable, then to threatening, then to invisible, and now I think we're starting to see a recognition that the poorer health of people with learning disabilities is not inevitable. It's not a function of a person's learning disability. A learning disability is an educational thing. It's not a health thing in itself. Many people have health needs which need support, but that's not the same thing as saying a learning disability is a health need in itself that needs action. And again, NHS England, I think, are pushing that further than certainly social services are, councils. But there are continuing preventable deaths of people with learning disabilities. This is LB. How many of you have heard of the Justice for LB campaign? Yep. Some people around this room. Okay, if you are on Twitter, I would urge you to follow right now LB Inquest. LB was a young guy who went into an ATU, an admission and treatment unit, so a kind of inpatient, supposedly specialist inpatient unit. So he's having kind of struggles, being quite kind of aggressive, anxious. So he's going there. So he should have got the kind of proper treatment support to help him, but he didn't. No. So he was having seizures, and he was left. Basically, he liked having long baths. He was in the bath, observed possibly on 15-minute schedule or maybe even less, and he had a seizure and drowned in the bath. In a unit where there's very high staff ratios, there are loads of staff around, supposed to be specialists. They ignored what was happening. A preventable death. His inquest is happening right now, today. It's happening over 2 weeks. We're into day 5 now. So if you are on Twitter, follow LB Inquest. It's very upsetting, though, I have to say, but I think we need to confront that is the reality of some services. So health, getting better, but still unequal. Sorry, I'm going on ages, is that all right? Sorry. So, life expectancy for people with learning disabilities in Sheffield over time. This is this line. It's going up. People with learning disabilities are living longer. Great. But the gap between people with learning disabilities and everyone else, which is the line at the top, is staying the same. So although people with learning disabilities are living longer, they're not, if you like, catching up to everyone else, and they're still dying younger than other people do. As Hazel mentioned, health checks. The blue line here is the number of people getting health checks. The red bar is the number of people identified by GPs as having a learning disability. And the grey bar is just the proportion of people with learning disabilities who are getting health checks. So the number of people getting health checks is going up, but the proportion is still under half. So there's still, so again, it's getting better, but it's still not equal. Human rights. I mean, I hesitate to say this with Vinton here, but human rights, I think, are quite historically recent, and I think certainly in England there's a question about whether they are under threat in a constitutional way. But increasingly we're seeing policy and law talking the language of human rights. So the Care Act, for example, you know, there's a very strong kind of human rights underpinning to that, and it was great to see the convention being handed out to everyone here. I think it's fundamental. But for people with learning disabilities, and for other people too, minor and major flouting of people's human rights seems to be quite widespread. And challenging them is becoming more difficult. Challenging those violations of people's human rights is becoming more of a challenge. We're seeing self-advocacy groups, the funding is being reduced. More and more commissioners are buying big, generic advocacy services almost as a branch of a service. And actually we need independent points of challenge from self-advocates. That's what we need. That's a kind of political lobbying function, which I think is really crucial for this. And legal aid being withdrawn. So in LB's inquest, his family get no legal aid or no support from the state for the inquest, whereas the NHS Trust and all the parties involved pay for their legal support from taxpayers' money. Inclusion. Before the institutions, there was little segregation, but there was also neglect, potentially. I think institutions were the first kind of big weight of the state machinery of segregation, and that was about protecting society from people. And I think we're seeing that the closure of the institutions wasn't enough. The hope was ordinary lives. If you close institutions and people live in ordinary houses and ordinary streets, inclusion will magically happen. It helped, but we're not there yet. And what's happening now? Well, we're seeing a drift towards more segregation, certainly in education. So this is the percentage of children with learning difficulties in mainstream education over time, over 4 years. And for children with mild learning difficulties, which is the blue bar, and then the red and green bars are children with severe and profound learning difficulties, the proportion of children in mainstream education is going down in all those groups of children. And I think also there's an issue about, if you like, I think kind of the move is away from explicit segregation, so big institutions or day centres, and there's a rhetoric around inclusion, but actually in people's day-to-day lives, are people still living relatively separate, segregated lives? Protective supported living and residential care, living with families in poor life circumstances, which means it's very hard for people to go out and do stuff and engage simply because of cash. Day centres, Andrew Power's work is interesting. He's been working with people with learning difficulties and looking at basically kind of where people go in people's day-to-day lives. And people have kind of little pockets of shelter, so it might be kind of the football ground, or it might be a particular cafe. And basically, the world is seen as indifferent or hostile, but they have places where they can go and feel safe and belong and part of it. Is that inclusion? And also, people with learning disabilities are facing with the consequences of living in an unequal society. So when we're talking about the spirit level, anyone heard of this spirit level? About how basically, if a society becomes more unequal financially, it's worse for everyone. It's worse for people at the top even, but it's really bad for people at the bottom. And most people with learning difficulties in kind of financial muscle are pretty near the bottom. And there are consequences of that. So this is the model from one of the authors of the spirit level. I just want you to take a moment to think about, if you're a person with learning disabilities, how are these things impacting upon you and on your life? So you're living in a world where, there's kind of worsening poverty for you probably, greater social status differences, less trust, reduced involvement in life in the community. If you're living in this kind of society, which the argument is that we're moving towards, that's not a very pleasant place to be living. And there are consequences in terms of people's health. So I've nearly wound up. Reasons to be fearful. This is a picture of Antonio Gramsci, who's sort of Italian communist philosopher dude, who I don't know much about, but Graham Finley put me onto him. And he said, he keeps drumming into me when I'm being miserable. Antonio Gramsci's phrase, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. So, the pessimism of the intellect, so if you really think about things, they're rubbish. Optimism of the will, despite that, we're going to carry on as if things are going to be great. So, pessimism, can't even say, see, that's how miserable I am, I can't even say pessimism of the, anyway. So, reasons to be fearful. I think this is the pessimism of the intellect bit. Huge number of people with mild and moderate learn difficulties who are vanishing from sight. Now, not everyone with who will get that label might want to be in sight necessarily. They might do perfectly well without support. But there are going to be a number of people who will be lost to recognition in terms of support for their learning disability and will be pitching up in hospitals, in GPs, unemployment, those kinds of things. People will still be there, but the support might be lacking. Cuts to support spending, as I've said, it's still being protected, but it's not enough in terms of demand and need, but it might actually be cut. And there's some types of service that are being cut now. The disappearance of self-advocacy groups who can challenge and scrutinise, and I can't emphasise enough how important I think this is. I think self-advocacy groups are our future, actually, if we're actually going to achieve anything at all. From some services, we're seeing an increasingly kind of defensive bunker mentality. I think we're seeing potentially, if we're being fearful, increasing everyday segregation. So it won't be labelled segregation, but in the experience of the person in that place, that's what it'll effectively be in people's day-to-day lives, in the name of protecting people. In my public health work, interestingly, there's lots of stuff about risk assessments and risk assessments of the risk of doing stuff. Public health terms, the biggest risk is never to go anywhere and do anything, actually, because you're in a place that's you're more likely to be abused, but also you have less physical activity, you have less vitamin D, even. You have less happiness, enjoyment in your life. That's worse than the risk of actually being out and doing stuff. And we might see increasing inequalities and further human rights abuses. But cheerful, and I think there are reasons to be cheerful. I think we're seeing coming through, and again, the kind of support of NHS England for people in those quite senior positions, I think, is really important here. A cadre of kind of confident self-advocates who are looking to take power. So it's not about being given power, it's about taking it. I think despite how personal budgets, they're kind of patching us, I think there's a potential of personal budgets for collective action. So not only kind of using it to commission your own support, but banding together. I think between us, we have power. We've got purchasing power, if you like. We can go out and really then demand the stuff that we want as a collective. I think as we see kind of services being cut, in some ways doing the kind of same old is no longer an option. Residential care is really expensive per person. How many people really need that? In this room, there'll be all sorts of creative ways in which we can support people, which don't necessarily mean more money, and it might mean less money. I think we're seeing greater scrutiny of organisations. That's really uncomfortable for the organisations, and it can feel really depressing because you're finding out about stuff which you just wouldn't have found out about before. But I think that's vital that we are clear-eyed when we're looking at those and understanding those, and I think that scrutiny will really help. Many organisations are opening to different ways of doing things, and I think there's a potential really to build a broad alliance. I think there are things that probably in this room pretty much all of us could agree on. We wouldn't agree on everything by any means, but there might be a few things that we can agree on and that collectively we can agree to push on. I'll finish with a very meaningful quote. As I said, I have 2 children, so I don't read philosophers, I don't read Antonio Gramsci, mainly I watch Merlin. And this is a quote from Gaius, and this is hopefully a hopeful message to take. The future is as... I can't do a Gaius voice, you'll be pleased to know. I'm getting to look like him, but... Yeah.
You said that, we didn't.
I know, I thought I'd say it first. The future is as yet unshaped. It is we that shape it. It is you, Merlin, and you are all Merlin in this room. The decisions you make, the actions you take, remember that. So destiny is, to some extent, what we make it. Thank you.